Did you ever watch Dr. Dolittle as a kid and wonder what it would be like to talk to animals? Or maybe like me, you've got a dog at home and you know what it's like to speak to an animal on a daily basis. Today's episode is all about interspecies communication. Kate Armstrong is director of InterSpecies Internet, an organization co-founded by musician Peter Gabriel, by internet pioneer Vint Cerf, one of the architects of the modern internet, MIT professor Neil Gershenfeld, and cognitive psychologist and marine mammal scientist Dr. Diana Race. Kate and I covered an array of topics: her work at InterSpecies Internet, the latest advancements in interspecies communication, a vision for planetary kinship with other species, and also some of the ethical debates and questions that lie at the centre of this work. So, without further ado, this is Kate Armstrong. Kate, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thanks, Seb.
So let's kick things off with what it is that you actually do.
It's a good question. I think I'm here because I'm the executive director of the InterSpecies Internet. And in that role, I act as a bit of a glue and organizer for a community of around 4,000 folks who are experts, enthusiasts, scientists, technologists, all of those kinds of weird and wonderful humans that are interested in the advancements in the field of interspecies communications.
How do you become the spearhead of this community?
By accident, I have to be completely honest. But I think, what really got me here and my trajectory so far has been around the idea of how we can explore and simplify complexity. So I studied design originally, and I went into design when design was having one of its many crises. It was kind of on this precipice of being something that was completely vocational based. So, you were going to be a graphic designer or a textile designer. Those are the two I studied. And it was in this transition towards something more of a tool, something more of a mechanism for allowing us to explore thinking and processing and developing, and ideating. And so I kind of got the tail end of that in my studies and then went on to explore how design processes, at that time it wasn't necessarily design, are involved with engaging communities, engaging various actors in developing different kinds of projects, different kinds of interventions, ways of working together. And that was always really interdisciplinary. And I think I've just always followed that as a bit of a curiosity of mine, and how those processes of bringing different types of people together around let's call them problems, but probably, they're more like challenges, can really create, for want of a better word, innovation, but novelties, I guess, is a better way to explain it. So along that journey, I found myself at a fab lab. So I don't know if, we all know what a fab lab is, but this is a small domestic scale digital fabrication laboratory. It's an outreach project of the MIT Center for Bits and Atoms. And I found myself at one of the almost 3,000 labs that there are globally. And this kind of piqued my interest in open source technology, technology deployment, and this interface of technology as a tool to actually be central to this kind of deliberation that happens in design. And from there, I was hooked. And it took me along about a 6-8 year path through the Fab Lab Network, Fab City, where I currently also serve as a CEO and management board member of Fab City Foundation, to the Interspecies Internet and the incredible work that they do with deployment and technology and interdisciplinary thinking.
Yeah. And so tell me about InterSpecies as an organization? Because as I understand it, there's some connection between Fab Labs and InterSpecies. But yeah, how did InterSpecies come about, and like what's the kind of the origin story there?
Yeah, so the origin story is a TED Talk from 2013. And I encourage everyone to watch this TED Talk because it puts in place how incredible these types of movements can be when they're shaped by thinkers like the four thinkers that are involved in the Interspecies project. So it tells a story of four experts, people really top of their field, getting together and coming up with a vision, which was, can we plug animals into the internet? Can we give them the same networking capability that we as humans have been provided by the networks of the internet? So this was Peter Gabriel, musician, and he had had an incredible interaction with playing music with animals and been really inspired. This is Vint Cerf, so founder of the TCP/IP protocol, one of the founders of the internet as we know it. Diana Reese, who is one of the first people to recognize that dolphins have selfhood, which is an incredible, advance forward in animal studies. And then the connector between the Fab Lab and the Interspecies Project is Neil Gershenfeld. So Professor Neil Gershenfeld is from MIT Center for Bits and Atoms. He's the father of Fab Labs. And he and Vint, they refer to themselves as the plumbers of the interspecies internet. So they're really interested in the technology and the deployments.
Yeah, interesting. I will try and get for the purpose of the recording a little excerpt of that music session that you kind of alluded to there. With is it chimpanzee who's playing? I think it is chimpanzee who's playing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Playing keyboard. And it's kind of a magical moment.
So I'm just behind, jamming. Yeah, this is what we started with. Sue's encouraging her to continue a little more. She discovers a note she likes, finds the octave. She'd never sat at a keyboard before.
So the four of them, I've seen the TED Talk. I guess the four of them,
Okay.
did they have a pre-existing connection to one another? Like I'm trying to picture in my head, like how did they come together as a four?
They're connected the way that people of their caliber are connected. And I don't mean to say that in, a fangirl kind of way, but,
Sure.
they're really on the same level of understanding and they've done, projects and different explorations together in the past. And I think what really is the catalyst or was the catalyst is this vision that was, driving the interest, which was, is this possible? And back in 2013, I think that was really in some ways quite speculative. But today we're really seeing that, with the right people in the room, it is actually possible and it's becoming far more possible. And I will also add that, animal communications as a field is just really quite rich. It's quite an old field of exploration, and so what we're doing in interspecies and what the trustees came together to do really sits on the shoulders of giants or elephants or whoever, and it really is about an augmentation and a development and an evolution of a field that is really rich with really incredible research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that this interspecies field, so there's a childish part of my brain that when we talk about interspecies communication, pictures kind of like Dr. Dolittle, in like direct dialogue, chatting back and forth with whatever animal might be in front of them. But tell me, like, what do we really mean when we're talking about interspecies communication? What's the kind of plethora of different ways in which that field is being explored?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think everybody's mind goes to either Dr. Dolittle, that kind of side of things, or, hey, I talk with my dog all the time. What are we talking about? Why do we need, why do we need technology? So what we're really looking at is two different modalities. So we have intraspecies communication and interspecies communication. So intraspecies would be, and I love this. I've heard from one of the first people who actually discovered that underwater animals are making sound. So this person was Marie Poland Fish, and this was back in the 1940s. She started working with the U.S. Navy. And in an article that she wrote, I think it was for Science magazine, she said that this is eavesdropping, what we're doing. And in actual fact, that's what that is. So the intraspecies work is understanding what is being said or communicated inside one group, so one specific species. So that would be where we would maybe use technology that could potentially translate or transduce signals and attempt to find meaning from those signals. That could be one side. The other is interspecies communication, which is more like the Doolittle situation. So this is about mediated experiences where we can find ways to translate via interfaces between ourselves and non-human animals.
And so obviously the organization is called Interspecies Internet. So is it the latter that you are solely focused on, or do you sort of look into the former as well?
We do all. And in actual fact, we have recently had some talks around plant communication. So we're really interested in the field as a whole. We're interested in how the different nuances of the field interconnect, because often you can't have one without the other, and some of the technologies, intersect. So we're really interested in building out that field, providing support for the technology sides. How can we support the field in terms of connectivity in technology, networking potential, deployment of, stack for technology. And then we're interested in one of the most important parts, I think, arguably, is the discourse development. So, what we're doing right now, actually kind of talking to people to let people know that this is a happening field, and it requires and does demand some attention. And also we talk about, how we can share and convene different workers in the field and different people who are interested in the wider field.
I guess on that, your point there about the discourse and almost sharing with people that this is a field that's going on and sharing the message of it. What is I guess why should people care if we put it really bluntly, beyond that kind of initial spark of interest, like, oh, could this happen? Could we somehow connect different species? Like, what are the parts of this that you feel are like really important for people to engage with?
Yeah, I think, when you hear it, or when you take a second thought, you start thinking, well, we do have quite a lot of, issues in the world. And is this one that we really need to focus on? But the end goal is something about planetary kinship. And it's about having a deeper understanding of who we are and the world that we belong to. And further to that, it's about the responsibility that we have. We are the most advanced tool makers on the planet. We always have been, and humans have a responsibility to use tools and create tools that can be beneficial to the other, billions of species that we share the planet with. So for us, that's the end goal. This is about reverence. It's about, reciprocity. It's about understanding our place within the universe, and really galvanizing that with the imagination, of course, those, captivating ideas of the Doodle machine or, Google Translate. That is important because that's where we kind of can galvanize this imagination and the possibilities of the technology. And I think in addition to that, the deployment applications that are being developed for this technology are truly wild. We're talking about life-saving both animals and non-human animals, deployments for human-animal conflict zones, these kinds of technologies that are actually working towards eventually being able to deter animals from harm in the wild, using some signaling systems that will actually feed back to humans so that would maybe influence our own decision making within environmental context. So it is really interesting to dream, but I also think that we can really look at some of the examples today and the potential deployments today and recognize that the dream is also having very, interesting and very worthwhile applications now and impacts now.
Mm. Yeah, really interesting. So if the big kind of sci-fi vision of the future is the Doolittle machine and the conversation with whatever animal it might be, actually it sounds like there are ways, like we already have the technology in place to have a real impact in the world. To go to your example you shared there in the like conflict zones, so what's actually being done there? Is it about sort of translating almost a message that we want the local wildlife to be able to receive and understand and respond to, or like how does that intervention actually work?
There are examples that do something like that. So one that I am personally quite fond of is one that uses olfactory senses. So we know that animals, there are many modalities of communication and signal reception, and one of the ones in the animal kingdom that is really heightened is smell. So I was recently shared a project via Amphibian, which is a innovation lab for nature out of the US, shared with me a really cool example of the use of AI to develop deterrent olfactory outputs. So this is basically smells that are developed by AI and inputs depending on what type of animal is detected within the environment. And that way that the communication system there is not one that we would necessarily recognize as communication because we're so heavily linguistic. But of course, that is a way to communicate with animals. And I think that, this is a really great example of how you can use those technologies quite simply, but really effectively. And there are similar ones for example, for auditory input. So there is a fantastic Swedish organization called Flocks, which is using these in really high risk areas like, for example, airports, in train lines, public transport, where you have a high risk for both animal and also human impact if a disaster happen. So they're using sound to deter animals and using AI to detect the animals where the animal is in that environment and different behavioral inputs. So you can have different kinds of applications, and the technology these days, I mean, the interfaces are really innumerable.
Yeah, it's a fascinating space. I mean, just thinking of my own uses here, similar, not quite the same, but my wife and I both have is it Merlin, the the
Yeah, from Cornell. Yeah.
bird song app,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like you can be out in the
Mm-hmm.
wilderness and just record clips, and behind the scenes,
Mm-hmm.
AI seems to be analyzing that and picking out, okay, these are the different species that were present and maybe how many of them there were, etc. Which seems like a really cool application. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a fascinating space.
Yeah, that is a really good example. And what you touch on there is something that's quite interesting, maybe a little on the nerdy side of this whole situation, but it's the data, right? So we're actually out there collecting, and in some cases, as you say, community science platforms, researchers in the field are collecting so much data, bioacoustic data, behavior data, geolocation. There is just so much data being collected. And actually, one of the interests that we have as an organization is to try and find some structure, try and find some way to support this huge amount of data that is being collected in the field that is required to then feed, for example, AI, as you mentioned, or other, modeling systems to come up with some of these, potential translations of, with hands in quotes, air quotes, of animal signals. So, yeah.
Mm. We've touched on a couple of examples already, but I guess what are the frontiers of interspecies communication that you're most excited about?
We've said it a few times. AI, I think, it's everywhere. You can't escape it. It's happening. But I think the application of large language models and the application of artificial intelligence within these types of fields is really nuanced, but it's also something that is going to be so useful to really expand and extend the field in quite a rapid manner. So it's really interesting. We did a session last year developing with our community a set of guidelines for how might we know as a community that we have translated an animal language, and what kinds of criteria need to go into that process of quote unquote translation. One of the key findings and the key sentiment from the community was, well, AI needs to be used as a tool actually, because the benefits are so high, but we actually really need to also ensure that that's coupled with a human eye. So we need the ground truthing by researchers in the field. So how do we use AI, or how do researchers use AI? Because I have to also preface, I'm no researcher, I'm no scientist. I'm here as a glue, and I'm here to communicate what I know of the field and in a kind of broad manner. But how AI is being used is to, number one, pass these incredible amounts of data. So that takes researchers a very, very long time. It's really something that can be quite arduous and quite a roadblock for a lot of this kind of research to move forward. So that's one way. Another way is matching. So you can take different types of modalities of data and actually match them together. So an example of that might be when animal says X, has X signal or makes X noise in X environment with X behavior, we can assume, Y. So we can have this kind of matching approach with the different forms of data. And then, of course, you have the examples that I gave, detection, behavioral detection. And actually, we have coming up a really nice new finding from the team at, I think, Google DeepMind and some other researchers around the use of AI generative tools actually for dolphin languages. So this is using basically a model that is akin to a human language model that generates suggestions based on what it's learning. And this is then being applied to signaling systems where we can detect some kind of pattern recognition, such as dolphins or whales.
Dolphins, I guess, for most, certainly for me, jump up as the obvious example of an animal that's just like clearly really smart, and I guess they're also very vocal in terms of making lots of noise. So I guess for me it raises this question of like, there are obviously lots of different ways in which species communicate, as we've touched on already. You know,
Mm-hmm.
smell might be one of them. There's language, body language, all sorts of different manners. So, do we know what's kind of our scientific best estimates of like what proportion of species out there are actually communicating or using language in a way that we might recognize as communication?
Yeah, that kind of splits the room, that question, because
Okay,
I think, and I can talk about it from a couple of different lenses. The first lens I would say is we can't actually scientifically really be sure at this
sure.
point. We don't
Hmm.
have anything that says X animal is, participating in, linguistics as humans are. But we do have a lot of researchers who are looking at that as a key kind of hypothesis. So we have a project in our community, or people who are in our community from Project SETI. They're working with robotics and AI and whales, sperm whales. And some of their findings are actually suggesting that the coders of whales, so that's the click sequences that whales make, are actually combinatorial. So they combine different sounds on a repetitive state. And they also are contextual. So that means that they are using specific signals for a specific reason or in a specific case. And they've even gone as far as to look at and to find evidence for structures within those coda that are reminiscent of phonetics and vowels. So whilst we can't say, yeah, this whale coda is X, Y, and Z, that level of research is quite phenomenal and has been brought about by the help and aid of AI. And it was actually done by Gaspar, who is head of linguistics at SETI project, which is interesting because linguistics is not always a term that's used in animal communication. So it's quite an interesting kind of interface between the human way and our obsession with language and our hyper use of language and sound and the animal behavior. So that's quite an interesting interplay. The other one I think is very interesting to talk about, some, let's say, similarities or touch points between the two would be work by Kath Hobater. So Kat is from St Andrews in Scotland and has worked with primates for a very long time. And the findings of the team suggest that primates use gestural combinations in order to create meaning. So for those people who are, listening on a podcast, you wouldn't be able to see it, but I'm wildly, as I talk, waving my hands around. I am a very visual kind of talker, and this all creates meaning. And in the case of many primates, the meaning is held solely in those gestures. So one example that Kat gave in a talk that we had was the way in which this specific primate rips a leaf actually signals something to a being in the group. So it's actually a way of flirting, so they say. So this is really interesting because we can make these similarities. We do a similar thing. We would, have a very physical way to show somebody that we may be interested in them, and so too do these primates. So we can find touch points. We can find kind of these crossovers in the way that animals communicate. And in the same breath, I will also add that there is definitely a risk when we're talking about this kind of field of this kind of anthropocentric view dominating the way that we look at it. And I think I am in two minds about this. I do believe that, when we anthropomorphize animal behavior, we can sometimes dampen the complexity of the individual animal, and we can dampen the nuance and the unique nature of these animals and the way that they communicate. But if we look at it from the storytelling angle and this discourse development angle and this idea of the imaginary that we were talking about, it's actually very, very useful. One of the most famous examples is Songs of the Humpback Whale by Roger Payne and Katie Payne. And Roger had heard some recordings that were made Frank Watlington, I think, he had originally made the recordings in the Navy, and the whale sound was interference on the tapes. When the tapes got declassified and released, they ended up with Roger Payne, and he went and actually transcribed the songs into music. And by doing this, I believe that it translated that whale communication into something that we as humans really value and that we put really, high on a pedestal, which is culture and song. And so I think by translating that animal signaling system into song, it really captured the imagination and helped us to get that one step further that we in InterSpecies Internet are really interested in doing. So that the way in which Roger Payne mediated that communication, I think is really interesting. I think it became one of the most widely pressed records in history. It went out in a Nat Geo mailer to like 10 million houses or something ridiculous. And I think it's still one of the most widely pressed records in the world. And I think that, whilst that, as I said, could run the risk of being kind of an anthropocentric way of looking at that animal communication system, it really has a place in developing the discourse and developing, how we interact and understand and value and find connection with the animal kingdom.
Mm. So it sounds like, yeah, whilst the realities of interspecies communication are incredibly nuanced and complex, like there's still something in our simple human brains that needs the reference point that makes it come alive. So yeah, I guess there's that kind of hearts and minds side of it that sounds like we need to get people to buy into the importance of it.
Absolutely. And, this is only further evidenced by the importance of domestic animals in this conversation. We talk a lot about wild animals and the need to work with animals in their natural habitat. Very important. We also, work with organizations and researchers that work with animals in human care. And the domestic space provides such an interesting experimental context because it's something that we're all really familiar with, right? A lot of people have dogs, a lot of people have cats, and a lot of people have probably seen dogs and cats pressing the Fluent Pet buttons on social media, which is this kind of button interface where a human can teach a learner, a dog or a cat, I think they have other animals at this point, to use the buttons in order to request or to, alert or to do other interactions with the human. And, this absolutely goes wild online. And that's because it's something we really all understand. And we all want to be a part of that. We all want to be a part of the narratives that come from that. We actually had a talk by one of the scientists from Fluent Pet who works with Fluent Pet, Federico Rossano, and he told about a story where, so basically the data that they've been able to pull using both video and also button capture shows that dogs and cats, that learners, they call them, are usually requesting or alerting. Those are the kind of two main outputs. So requesting is usually treat, scritches, walkies, all the classic dog kind of, communication
simple
moments.
demands, simple demands.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
just we're all aware of them. And then the second is alerts. So one thing, he commented about the fact that they'll often be alerting their humans to the presence of somebody outside, which is often, a postman or an Amazon kind of delivery person. But in one case, one of the animals, and I think it was a cat, actually alerted the human to smoke in the house and saved the family, was given a medal from the fire brigade, all this kind of thing, which is just, those are the stories we want to be a part of, right? We want to be part of that imaginary and in this case, the real situation. But those are the things I think that as humans, they really drive our attention and we think, yeah, that's something that is beneficial. And if in one case it saves a life, fantastic. The rest of the time, the dog will get a walk. So that's great.
Yeah, and I guess it's an interesting thing because I have a dog who is somewhere around my feet right now.
Mm.
And there's no doubt in my mind that he is continuously communicating with me in a whole bunch of different ways, whether he chooses to bark at the door when the postman knocks, or whatever it is. And I think there's a nuance to the ways that a dog can also understand our communication. My wife is
Mm-hmm.
pregnant at the moment. There is no doubt that the dog knows that she is pregnant and is like responding accordingly, and whether that's smell or I'm not certain of the science there. But I guess the example here with pets, for those who haven't seen it, you have these mats of like buttons that are on the floor, and I guess to your point, you start with the simple ones, like this button says the word treat and a treat comes your way, and pretty quickly, I guess a dog puts two and two together and knows, like, hit that button, treat's coming my way. But then that, in the case of some dogs, it seems, I think I looked up one that's called Bunny, it's like an
Mm-hmm.
English sheepdog,
Mm-hmm.
and there's something, I don't know the exact number, but there's something like 100 buttons on the floor, and this dog is not simply hitting a button for a treat and leaving it at that, but is like combining various buttons in ways that at least has the appearance of being quite complex, quite complex kind of structure, conceptually. But I mean, I guess what I'm getting at here is almost like, yeah, it seems like our pets are already communicating with us, and these buttons just provide this interface to
Mm.
make it understandable to us. To your point, the alerting, okay, I don't bark at the door anymore, but I press the button that says somebody's at the door, as an example.
Yeah. And I think that, there's also quite a split in the community around this, around how useful what the actual nuance of that is, I guess. So, for example, dogs themselves, I believe this research came out from an evolutionary biology side that suggested that dogs actually evolved to have eyebrows so that they could communicate with humans, because eyebrows, or that eyebrow muscle, shows empathy to humans. These kinds of things, which is like, well, maybe dogs have also evolved the opportunity, the ability to learn from us, and that is very true. There's a split within the community of, do we introduce synthetic tools, synthetic languages, or do we look to, as I said, kind of, let's say, eavesdrop and try to understand and elicit what's happening inside a natural group or a natural context. And this is a very interesting ethical discussion, which does happen quite often. And the other extension to that, of course, is, well, dogs have spent the last X 100,000 millions of years learning our communication. When are we going to turn around and learn theirs? Right. So that's also kind of this other look at the centering of the human in this. And part of the role that we also do in terms of that is decentering the human. How can we actually look at things from the animal's perspective? And that's really important also when we look at the design of interfaces, for example. There is some fantastic research that doesn't teach a dog to use tools, but actually creates tools that are natural to the dog, and through use the dog understands the fact that a different output is elicited when they use that tool.
Mm. Mm. Dogs, cats, I guess domestic pets seem like, to my mind at least, kind of one category, because they're obviously already not living in a kind of natural environment, and there are obviously already ways in which they're adapted to our lives, and we incorporate them. Tell me a bit more about the ethical questions and considerations that come up for wild animals, or even plants you touched on as well. Like, what are the sort of tough questions that are being spoken about in relation to that?
Yeah, this is really important, and it's definitely a rising issue. We hear a lot of a lot of different perspectives on it, and we really encourage that because, you know, as a convening body, we want to create this platform where those different perspectives can find air and be discussed. So there are quite a lot of different approaches to this. Some come from a conservation perspective, some from more of a welfare perspective, some from animal rights perspective. There's lots of different considerations. Everybody that we work with works under international animal guidelines. This is very important that, you know, everything that happens within those guidelines. But beyond that, we're starting to get to a point where we have on one side a rise in nature rights, so, you know, rights of nature movements and personhood movements and these kinds of conversations. And these start to interface with data collection from populations that are wild and unaware of, you know, the fact that we're collecting their bioacoustic behavioral data. And, you know, the actual output of that can become complex. So when we think of, you know, the deployment of technologies that can geolocate an animal, they could be used for good, for deterring the animal from harm, but they could also, of course, be used for contexts that we would not like to think about, such as poaching. So we have to think about the way in which we deploy these within ethical guidelines and frameworks, and we have to try to adhere as much as possible to the development of a guideline on an international level, because we haven't quite got to a point where AI regulation, digital regulation interfaces with nature or the natural world. On the other side of this, we also have, you know, the movement for personhood. So, you know, and rights of nature. So these conversations are more akin to conversations of actually allowing animals or non-human animals the ability to be represented in, for example, a legal context or a regulatory context. So we have a lot of movement in the South Pacific, so in also in Micronesia, in this area where you have a lot of whale movement, and you have a very strong connection between, for example, Maori people and whales. There is a big move with the Maori populations to try to ameliorate the relationship that humans have with these animals through both cultural and legal frameworks. So this is about, you know, creating representation processes for whales and allowing whales through representatives, through legal representatives, to be part of frameworks of regulation or policy. And, you know, this is really important because in many cases and in many jurisdictions, animals are still seen as property. So in order to protect them further and to ensure their welfare, this really does need to evolve. And if we are looking, you know, at a whale or, for example, a marmoset monkey, these tiny little monkeys, highly social creatures, we just, you know, have some new findings coming out this year that suggest that they have vocal labels for each other, which basically means they have names for each other. So how can we look at a social group of primates and go, oh, cute, they have names for each other, and yet see them in many cases as property with no real ability to be, you know, leveraged within frameworks that would protect them, but also protect the habitats that they live in, for example. So yeah, this is ongoing and it's a very complex space, but it is being very well supported. We work, for example, with the Moth Project. They work closely with the SETI project. So, and, you know, there are a lot of really wonderful organizations like Animals in the Room who are looking to really understand the complexity of this and bring it forth and ensure that it's taken care of because of this need to ensure that we are working towards this, you know, planetary kinship and this reciprocity of respect and interrelation with the natural world.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the legal frameworks and side of this. I've long admired an organization called Client Earth, who you may or may not have come across, who are basically seemingly a team of badass lawyers who use the legal framework to try and kind of win cases in favor of the planet. And so yeah, it's interesting to think about the animals' perspective in all of this, and how do we bake that into these legal frameworks such that they get the appropriate protections. And I guess the other this in my mind goes back to that thing we were talking about around the hearts and minds story of this, because with the marmoset that have names for each other, that's something I guess that we can relate to in a way that we can't necessarily relate to the fact that fungal networks are connecting all of the trees in a forest and they are communicating to each other. So it feels like, yeah, we need that emotional lens just to kind of get people to engage with the nuance of it.
Yeah, and sometimes it seems granular, right? So sometimes it just feels like we're focusing on this one tiny individual animal in this expansive planet that is hyper-connected, and as you said, is really connected on an atomic level that we cannot ever imagine. But I think that our role as humans, and as I said, as the best toolmakers on this planet, is to try to ensure that granularity isn't lost on us, and we can create something from this huge brain that we have that actually, does make that one individual marmoset count inside our minds and inside the way that we see, the deployment of something so huge as, the internet. And I think, we have this kind of idea that, technology is something that we hold in our hands and that, we're always kind of connected to. But it is actually a way for us to belong somewhere else outside of ourselves and to find connections outside of ourselves. And that was, the original internet was an opportunity to connect machines. This is what Vince says in the TED Talk. And he says, suddenly we realized that we were going to connect people. And now I think what we're connecting is far beyond that. We're connecting concepts, and we're connecting, our understanding of what is consciousness and what is our role as this huge brain toolmaker in the world. We're really connecting that granular example towards something that is really planetary.
Yeah, it's sort of on one level like mind-boggling to even think about as you start to kind of zoom out and think of everything that's being connected. If we, it's obviously hard / impossible to predict the future here, and it sounds like there are so many amazing frontiers of research going on. But I'm curious what your sort of hopeful vision of the future is in this space. If we fast forward however many years into the future, like what are the things you hope to see, in your lifetime?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about the possibility that we have to further protect the world around us, and I think I gave the example of developing deterrent technologies to ensure that, animals are kept from harm's way. But I think, the eventual aim of that will be that the systems actually are changed in response to those deterrents so that we don't actually have a need for them in the first place, right? So I think it's really slow going in terms of, how you use the data from for example, how many birds are injured in airports per year. If we really understand the global impact of that economically and also, from an environmental perspective, we may start to design airports differently, right? So we come back to this idea of, for me, as a designer, it's about the process and it's about linking the different aspects together. And I think that if we could get to that point, then the role of the interspecies internet starts to make sense. It starts to have that influence that is required at a policy level, at a deployment level, at a technology level, at an urban level, and then we can really see that all these tiny little granular, primates running around doing different things are actually contributing to this overall development of and I think also not only development, but regeneration of the systems that we've designed and rethinking the systems that we've designed beyond ourselves. Yeah.
So it's sort of about creating those feedback loops that have an impact in the way we consider these things to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, the IMF actually did a study about the monetary value of a whale. Turns out they're really valuable. They actually sequester the same amount of CO2 as, 1,000 trees or something in their lifetime, and puts the population of all whales in the world as something like 1 trillion. We can look up the stats exactly. So there is a way for us to kind of interlink our hyper-capitalist mindset with the potential of these kinds of technologies. And I think that the more we work on this interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary lines of inquiry through organizations like the InterSpecies Internet, the closer we will become to recognizing that that type of intervention is possible.
It begs the question in my mind about what these different species might say to us. I was reading, I think was it last week or a couple of weeks ago, because there's been this spate of orcas sinking boats around different parts of Europe, and there was another yacht. There was this kind of crazy footage of these orcas just nailing this yacht off the coast of Portugal and ultimately sinking it. So yeah, if they're not already trying to tell us something, then I wonder as our understanding evolves, what are the messages that we might receive, and probably some tough things to hear that we need to hear.
Yeah, I think then humans will say, "Oh no, we don't really use hearing as a sense. We don't really know what you're saying." I think we will be in a position to potentially ignore what they have to say. No, I mean, I think this is the ultimate question. I always laugh once I saw a cartoon that had 2 whales in a vinyl store, like a record store, and one of the whales is holding up the Songs of the Humpback Whale disc, and the caption of the cartoon says, "Can't believe they got me breaking up with Sharon on this record." So it's like, okay, what are they going to say to us? But what are they actually saying? And should we be listening, And there's this whole kind of hilarious irony to all of this really intense, and very important research is we just don't know. And we just don't know until we get there. And I think that, there's lots of speculation that we can create, but and I think that curiosity drives us, and we need that curiosity to wonder, what are they actually going to say about us? Why are they playing football with our super yachts? But that's kind of, that's part of the inquiry, I think.
Mm, mm. So, Kate, I know we've covered a lot of ground here. If people want to learn more about interspecies communication as a field, as an organization, obviously they can go to the website. But beyond the website, are there any particular kind of resources or things that you would recommend for people to check out?
Yeah, we run a quasi-monthly talk with experts. So most of the experts that I've talked about today, they actually have been in our lecture series. So these are members of our community. They've got new research to share. They've got fascinating stories about, cats signaling fire alarms and marmosets chatting to each other. So it's really, honestly, one of the most inspiring monthly events. You can join it live, or you can also watch that on our YouTube. The details are on our website. And we share snippets on our social media. You can always follow us there. We do every now and then do in-person events that we also share via our social media. But I think, the best place to go is to join the conversation in those talks, because we have a Q&A, and you can ask whatever you want. So I think that's a really great forum to bring people together to discuss it. And then you can also join our Slack. So we have a Slack where you can actually meet with other people. And that's always a great way to continue those conversations between different experts and enthusiasts.
Amazing. Well, I will make sure to include links for everything that we mentioned in the show notes, so
Awesome.
people can check that out. That feels like a good place to wrap us up here, Kate. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and thanks for coming on Humans in the Loop.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Seb.